Good morning and welcome to the Caregiver Teleconnection. My name is Glenda Rogers and I'm going to be the facilitator for today's session. This is the third in our series on engaging caregivers, a program for healthcare workers. And today we're going to be talking about diversity, gender, and caregiving with Lucy Barylak and Dr. Elliot and Sklar. Before they get started, let me introduce you to them if you are not aware of what their background is. Dr. Elliot Sklar is a public health professional focused on supporting the health of the public through academic work, research, and service. He has led healthy aging programs for seniors and for caregivers in Canada, Florida, and virtually. Dr. Sklar is an associate professor of healthcare sciences at Nova Southeastern University in Florida. He publishes and presents his work internationally, which is focused on the complexity of issues related to aging and caregiving. Lucy Barylak received her master's degree in social work from McGill University and has dedicated her career to supporting caregivers. Lucy was the founder and long-term care manager of Caregiver Support Center, a respite program for family caregivers. There, she oversaw multidisciplinary training across caregiving, mental health, elder abuse, and palliative care. In 2003 and again in 2012, she received the Queen's Jubilee Award presented by the Canadian Home Care Association, awarded for her dedication in developing a national coalition to support the issues and challenges facing informal caregivers. Ms. Barylak also co-edited a book for healthcare professionals, Responding Creatively to the Needs of Caregivers. She has been a key architect of screening and assessment tools of family caregivers, for which she provides training to healthcare professionals across North America. Lucy consults for private industry, including WellMed Charitable Foundation and clinics in Texas. Additionally, Lucy is a liaison supervisor at the School of Social Work at McGill University, where she currently supervises 20 interns. Welcome, Lucy and Elliot.
Thank you so much, and welcome to all of you participating. I wanted to quickly just review our learning objectives today. We do have these as for those who want a certificate of attendance, you can email caregiverteleconnection@wellmed.net to receive one. And this is why our training series this month includes these learning objectives, because we hope that our participants will walk away from these programs knowing how to discuss the role of diversity in healthcare, how to demonstrate basic knowledge of cultural competence, how to recognize differences in caregiver experience based upon gender and sexuality, identify strategies for supporting diverse patients and caregivers, and to distinguish opportunities for achieving cultural competence in long-term care. So it might seem obvious to some of us, but I think it's important for all of us to first define what culture is, because that definition might actually be different for some of us. So culture is the major elements of symbols, languages, norms, values, different artifacts. It also includes language, because language makes it possible to have effective social interaction among community members within a certain culture. In addition, I think that culture is also very much influenced by our upbringing and how we view culture. I included here this famous saying that we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are, because I think it is so true. And actually what we learn about a lot of the health disparities in healthcare have to do with the fact that healthcare providers often only see things through the lens of their own life experience, and sometimes have a harder time understanding the life experiences or challenges that might come with coming from a certain culture or gender or sexual identity, as an example, especially in today's world. So we have some statistics here just to reinforce how very diverse the body of caregivers are. And again, this data comes from the 2020 AARP report, Caregiving in the US, We are very eager to see some updated data because we believe very much that COVID has actually changed the demographics of caregivers. It has created more diverse caregivers, potentially some younger caregivers as well. So I think it is important for us to think about the fact that the data that we look at does not include the experience with COVID, and also that this data is averaged across the entire United States. Certainly those of you who might be working in certain areas might have higher concentrations of diverse caregivers in certain areas more so than others. 39% of caregivers in the 2020 study identified as being culturally diverse. And I believe that this is certainly an underreporting, as we also know that caregivers from diverse backgrounds are often less likely to self-identify as caregivers, because providing care might be a natural, common, and expected tradition in a given culture. So 17% of these caregivers reported being Hispanic or Latino, and we know in this community specifically, caregivers are especially less likely to identify because it is an expected part of a family role and continuum of caring for one another. 14% of caregivers reported being African American or Black, 5% Asian American and Pacific Islander, and 3% of caregivers reported being an other kind of race or ethnicity, including multiracial. Another important thing here is that 11% of students enrolled in college reported being caregivers. And as Glenda mentioned, I'm a university professor, and it's amazing to note that across the United States, so few colleges and universities have resources to support student caregivers. And yet they account for, in this study, 11% of all college students. 9% of caregivers reported being in the Army or the U.S. Armed Forces, and 8% self-identified as LGBTQ, something we'll talk about a little bit later more, and also an area of underreporting that we know of. I do see that we have some chats. I just wanted to go through those. Okay, they just deal with the certificate of attendance, all good. I do have a quick question for everyone. Does anyone know what Cultural Heritage Month we're in right now? Since we're talking about diversity. And we were talking about game shows ahead of our program. So I felt like this just fit perfectly. Let's see.
They have it.
Yep, that's right. It is Hispanic Heritage Month, and that is celebrated from September 15th through October 15th. Very good. Awesome. So I always show this, and you can do this search from your own computer. But just as our population is becoming more diverse, so are our seniors and caregivers. We know this, right? But if you look at this screenshot that I've shown you from my own Google image search, under the search terms family caregiver, if you look under the images tab, you will find that most caregivers are depicted as white women, and most healthcare workers are supporting seniors and caregivers, rather, are depicted as women of color. Do you see any LGBTQ couples? I don't think I do, at least. But it's something that we'll circle back on later as we talk about this community. Now, the common depictions of caregivers and outreach efforts to caregiving populations has really not caught up to the reality of caregiving in America. And I'm actually very honored to be giving a talk about this in November at the American Public Health Association meeting about men and caregiving, because it is an area of great disparity, and we have had such an increase in the number of males who are caregivers. Another group we'll talk about today during our program. When it comes to medical care, though, and this is really important for those participating or listening in, studies have found that African American and Hispanic caregivers report feeling invisible in medical facilities. Caregivers know their care partner's medical history, their symptoms, their needs. So when there are communication breakdowns where people feel invisible, that can really result in poor medical outcomes for the caregiver, also for the patient. So I think it's important that we look at the images that are reflected back to us. And I encourage you to take a look on your own Google, on your phone or your computer, and look up family caregiver and see what images it shows you in your search. I think you'll find that they lack diversity or that they reinforce stereotypes. So for those of you who work professionally with diverse caregivers, I believe that cultural sensitivity training is so important. We get a little bit of this in school, but not enough. And that includes also learning how to communicate with diverse caregivers. So it's so important to engage in trainings like this because it helps to reduce presumptions or misconceptions about others' experiences and to ensure also the best possible results for caregivers and their care partners. I just asked a few minutes ago what Cultural Heritage Month we were in, and that's something that's important to me because when I work with diverse communities, I always like to acknowledge, commemorate, or celebrate something that might be happening that relates to a given culture. It also shows people that I am interested and I take an investment in learning about different cultures, which I think is so important. People want to know that you're curious or that you care. And there are so many points of commonality that I think that we all share. For example, you can ask questions if you're in someone's home, like, I smell that you're making some food. It smells delicious. What is that? Or we always talk about the weather. I love how this weather is cooling down or how hot it is. I think it's also important for healthcare workers to familiarize themselves with local resources for diverse caregivers or caregivers in a specific community, for example, through local temples or churches or community nonprofits. And one way can be looking on Google. It's an excellent referral mechanism, I think. Some younger generations even use TikTok for that purpose to see what might be around them through a video. But you can also call 211, and that can be a great referral mechanism for you in the United States to be able to know what might exist in a local community or to be able to have resources to which you can provide your clients or your patients. You can also ask your caregivers to educate you about their culture and traditions. And I think that's one of the best ways to show an interest and an appreciation and respect for someone's culture. Many of us do this in the workplace where we have like a potluck and everyone brings something from their unique culture together. But since we live in a more virtual world as a result of the pandemic, we might not have as much interaction with others who might come from different cultural backgrounds, and that's important.
Okay, so here's a question for everyone to kind of think about it. Does the gender of a caregiver matter? Think about that for a moment. I can tell you that the gender of a caregiver does matter. And though our intentions might be to feel that it doesn't matter, it does. Within our complex system of long-term care, women's caregiving is essential in providing the backbone of support. In fact, the value of the informal care that women provide ranges from 148 billion to 188 billion annually. Women provide the majority of informal care to spouses, parents, parents-in-law, friends, neighbors, and they play many roles while caregiving. There's hands-on health provider, care manager, friend, companion, surrogate, decision maker, and advocate. Many studies have looked at the role of women and family caregiving. Although not all have addressed gender issues and caregiving specifically, the results are still generalized to women because they are the majority of informal care providers in this country. Caregiving poses greater financial challenges for many women workers, due mostly to lost wages for reduced work hours and time out of workplace, family leave, or early retirement. Women are more often caring for 2 or more adults, 27% versus 20% for men caregivers. So a greater proportion of caregivers report caring for a man, 39%, than it was in 2015. It was only 35% at that time. 41% of caregivers who have been providing care for 5 years or longer or more often report caring for a man. 43% of caregivers of baby boomers are now caring for a man, an increase over 2015, which was then at 33%. So that's a real big jump. Studies find that men respond to caregiving responsibilities in a fundamentally different way. Women tend to stay home and provide the care, time-consuming care of a disabled friend or family member, while men respond to the loved one's needs for support by delaying their retirement. So they work much longer, and in part to shoulder the financial burden associated with the long-term care. The impact of women's intensive caregiving can be sizable. There's a lot that they go through. Now, I want to also tell you that 1 in 5 female caregivers aged 18 to 39 said that stress was nearly always present in their lives. That's a lot to take in. Nearly twice as many as those who were not caring for male caregivers. The negative impact on caregivers' relationship and social networks due to their reduced ability to participate in activities outside their caregiving role can lead to caregivers experiencing social isolation. And we know that caregivers do isolate themselves for many reasons, which in turn can impact on their psychological well-being. Studies have demonstrated that women are more vulnerable than men to the effect of reduced social support. The physical impact of providing care can lead to long-term care needs for female caregivers. For example, this is interesting, a national survey found that 21% of female caregivers had mammograms less often. Okay, so they're probably not going to the doctor as often as they should. 25% of women caregivers have health problems as a result of their caregiving activities. Coronary heart disease, CHD, is one physical risk factor of caregiving. Women who spend 9 or more hours a week caring for an ill or disabled spouse increase their CHD risk twofold. Other health effects include elevated blood pressure and increased risk of developing hypertension, lower perceived health status, poor immune functions, slower wound healing, and an increased risk of mortality. So that's a lot to take into consideration and think about. Frequently, support service can make a real difference in the day-to-day lives of caregivers. Research has shown, for example, that counseling and support groups in combination with respite and other services have positive direct effects on health behavior practices and assist caregiving in remaining in their caregiving role longer with less stress and greater satisfaction. In fact, women are more than twice as likely as men to say that they would benefit from talking to someone about their caregiving experience. Further, some studies have shown that actual linkage to service in lieu of information only programs are more beneficial to caregivers. That's why you should refer the Wellman Charitable Foundation Caregiver Teleconnection is a great example of this, where participants can share their experience and learn from other caregivers. So what it's basically saying is that really caregivers do need that support. It should include in all the services that are provided.
It's so interesting how for female caregivers, the thing that has made the most help across research for them is actually speaking to a healthcare professional, a mental health professional if possible. Whereas that is very different for men. And we're going to talk more specifically about tips to support male caregivers, because as opposed to women, men actually find that peer support is more beneficial. So as an example, speaking to another male who might have had a caregiving experience or who might be going through something similar. So there are more and more online virtual support groups for male caregivers where they can interact with peers, including here, the Caregiver Teleconnection is a great example. It's one of the few programs that I'm aware of since its inception, which was first by telephone, where we had a much higher percentage of men participating than traditional caregiver support programs. And I believe that that was because of two things. At first, the telephone allowed for anonymity. It was a more comfortable, safe space for men. But in addition, this element of peer support, which we know is something that is so much a part of the caregiver teleconnection platform, learning from one another, is very helpful for male caregivers. So if you are a healthcare worker and you're trying to help encourage a male caregiver to get support, consider that support groups might be very beneficial for them with other men, that they might find these online as an example. Look for resources that might exist in your local community and be strategic, because male caregivers also are more likely to accept help if they believe that it will benefit their care recipient more than focusing on it benefiting themselves. So try to consider this when you're making tips or suggestions for a male caregiver, that again, they're more likely to benefit from peer support and more likely also to receive support services if they feel that it will help their care recipient more so than themselves. And I see that we have a comment here from Andre. And Andre, we always appreciate your comments and your input. You always have such great perspectives and experiences to share with us. So we really thank you. And Andre wrote, indeed, gender matters, if only for the social role associated and expected of the men of the preceding generation. I remember my father telling me, while he was the main caregiver for my mother, that if the roles were reversed, my mother would do a much better job than he was because it was natural for her, which it was, but I know he thought also of the act of caring naturally and spontaneously associated to women more than men. That's such an amazing comment, and I want to thank you for sharing that personal experience. And I think that might also lend to why it is that you found yourself in a helping health profession. Because it is true, as we began our program talking about culture and that we see things as we are, not as they are. Life experiences are very impactful and they're very motivating in terms of how we view caregiving as well. And I appreciate the comment because, again, when you think of the Google image that I shared, there's such a lack of representation of male caregivers, which needs to really change, because I do believe there are more than 39% of caregivers are male. I do think that things are changing, and it's something that we need to be discussing more, because when you look across the board at caregiver support programs, for example, we have a place for mom. I'm sure you've seen that advertised on TV. Well, where's the place for dad? It's even just gendered in that regard. So I think it's important.
It's interesting what you're saying about this topic, because I remember when we first opened the Caregiver Support Center, very few men would come. But then I decided that maybe they would come if we would have a cooking, a bit of a cooking program, so that they could learn to cook, so that their spouses would be able to eat better. And we got a room full of men, very much, that they felt they were coming not necessarily for them, but because it would benefit the person that they're caring for. Very interesting.
Yeah, and that holds true for cultures as well. I used to run programs in Little Haiti in Miami, and we had cooking classes with very, very low participation. But we changed things around and we asked people to bring their most cherished family recipe. And what we would do is work with a nutritionist to adapt it to be a little bit more healthy given a person's nutritional needs, or if they had hypertension, we would try to find a way to lower the sodium. And then what happened is they would wind up inviting members of their family and their friends, because it was something they were proud to share, and other people would benefit too, since we were all learning together how to take something that was cherished to them and make it healthier. So there are lots of different approaches, and I think it's important that we consider them. We know that creativity is so very needed when working with caregivers. So we are also, speaking of diversity, going to talk a little bit about the LGBTQIA+ community. And we know that that's an acronym that changes over time. I want to explain first what it stands for at present: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and or questioning, intersex, and asexual or ally. And then we have the plus, and sometimes it's 2+ because there's also individuals who might be two-spirited, and then plus because there might be individuals who may not identify with any of those titles or labels. So it's important that that we know what all these things stand for. Lucy and I will use LGBTQ just for the purpose of our conversation today, because it's easier, frankly, to say than the longer acronym. It's a mouthful.
Thank you for that, Elliot. I will be using LGBT. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. All right, everyone. You know, informal and unpaid caregiving of chronically ill adults is far more common among the LGBT individuals than non-LGBT adults. And stronger support system for that community, for those caregivers, are needed, particularly for those who are giving care to a friend and not to a partner or biological family member. LGBT adults become caregivers at a slightly higher rate than their non-LGBT peers. A recent survey of the LGBT baby boomers found that a growing number of aging adults expected to be treated with respect and dignity at the end of their life. In spite of this, 1 in 5 of the LGBT adults surveyed cited fear of double discrimination for being older and being LGBT as a significant concern about their aging process. The fears are particularly important to seniors moving into nursing homes or residential care facilities, which will, we're going to speak a little bit more about that later in the program. So many LGBT people form strong families of choice, in addition to their families of origin, as a way of coping with possible or actual rejection by parents, sibling, and other relatives for being open about their sexual orientation or gender identity. Even as attitudes have changed and the LGBT people have become more visible and accepted, families of choice still provide invaluable networks of emotional and social support. Nearly 2/3 of LGBT older adults said they considered their friends to be chosen families. Being a member of both a chosen family and a family of origin creates a situation where an LGBT person may become a primary caregiver for a spouse, domestic partner, or legal spouse, a close friend who is also LGBT, or an aging parent or other relatives, sometimes at the same time. So in the community at large, it is most common for informal caregivers such as spouses and adult children to provide the majority of care to older adults in the United States. In the LGBT community, with older adults twice as likely to be single and living alone, and 3 to 4 times less likely to have children, a family of choice is dependent upon providing support and care. So as I said before, LGBT adults are less likely to have children, who are a main source of family caregiving. LGBT caregivers are younger, less likely to be married, more racially and ethnically diverse, and more likely to be of low socioeconomic status than non-LGBT caregivers. Research has already shown that the majorities and that minorities and those of lower socioeconomic status are less likely to access and utilize resources and community support. So we really have to be very conscious about that if we're aware that clients are in that community, and if they're not reaching out, maybe we need to reach out a little bit more. The approach to sexual orientation and gender identity in mental health care often groups together anyone in the LGBT community, when these communities are considered at all. This method can be problematic as each subcommittee faces unique challenges rates of mental illness and experience. So you could just go look at the slide and see the diversity in that community as well, and the different issues that each one may be facing. The LGBT community encompasses a wide range of individuals with separate and overlapping challenges regarding their mental health. Other identity factors include race, economic status can affect the quality of care they receive or their ability to access care. Additionally, members of this community may face harassment or lack of cultural competency from potential providers. These experiences could lead to fear of disclosing sexual orientation or gender identity due to the potential discrimination of healthcare workers' biases. So we have to be very, very conscious of that, and just really recognize there are a lot of people out there that may be afraid to kind of talk about who they are, what they're doing, and it's our responsibility as healthcare workers to try and advocate for this group.
We had a comment from Andre linking back to gender, and he had said that the cooking class is a great idea. One more personal anecdote, my father was a physician, and when my mother began showing signs of her dementia, having difficulties in her usual cooking her usual recipes, the first request from my father was to ask me how to prepare a can of soup. He was facing tremendous challenges in the simplest tasks, which for him were totally unfamiliar. And that is something that I think many, many men relate to, not having had that experience of knowing how to care in that way. Thank you again for sharing that.
Thank you, Andre, for that, for sure. It's a good point.
It's an excellent point. I think it's also really important, as I was speaking earlier, about understanding the lived experiences of the people that we're working with. It's really important to understand that older LGBT adults that are seniors right now have had very unique experiences, most likely with healthcare. When you consider that it wasn't until 1973 that the American Psychiatric Association removed the diagnosis of homosexuality from its second edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders or Diseases. So I've said before, if you think about 1973, let's just say that someone was born in 1950. They were then 23 when the APA removed this diagnosis of homosexuality as a mental disorder. And certainly any young adult who is of a different sexual identity could benefit from mental health counseling if, the world around them believes that this is a disorder. So that person who was born in 1950 would have also been only 19 when Stonewall occurred. And that was the first time a gay bar in New York was raided, and the patrons fought back. And it was an event that stirred up the gay pride movement. So that was very significant in 1969. And they would have been now 65 years old when gay marriage became legal in the United States. So imagine living to be 65 and never being able to get married or obtain the benefits of marriage, like Family Medical Leave Act, which allows people to take a leave of work if they have to care for a spouse. So that person that I mentioned, born in 1950, would be about 73 today. So think of what that life course experience might have been like. And as a result, LGBT older adults are 5 times less likely to seek medical care or social services than the general public. So at least, and I say at least because the number keeps going up every time I check it, there have been about 417 anti-LGBT bills passed this year in state legislatures across the United States, a new record according to the ACLU as of April, when I personally stopped counting. 24 of those bills were signed into law in 11 states so far, including Florida, where I live. And a majority of these laws relate to healthcare or education. So I can speak for myself when I say that it makes it hard for me to feel safe and comfortable, sometimes not knowing what the personal beliefs of a healthcare provider might be, given that I live in a state in which I can be denied medical care if I disclose my sexual identity. So for many LGBT older adults, that fear is very real. And as such, internalized homonegativity, and that's what we call homophobia or self-hatred when it's turned inward, discomfort with one's own sexuality, can link with trauma, challenges with intimate relationships, and they might have their own mental health consequences that Lucy was speaking of earlier. So we've talked about diversity and culture, and we've provided some different examples. And I think, it's important that we take it a step further. There's a lot of research, as an example, that shows a higher rate of Alzheimer's and other dementias among LGBT adults. And when looking further, the research links with other health conditions and health disparities, which might be a factor in this increased prevalence among LGBTQ community members, but it's also important to note that we don't understand exactly what causes Alzheimer's and other dementias. So we're moving closer to having those answered. But what we're saying here is there isn't a genetic link between being a member of the LGBTQ community and Alzheimer's and dementia. There are some overall health and social factors that exist because of the disparities that exist in our environment, in our community. The same holds true for African American communities as well. There are higher rates of Alzheimer's and dementia among Hispanics, among Black Americans, and these link with other issues that we've discussed during our program today. That's why cultural competence is so important. And it's a very important buzzword in healthcare. Cultural competence is what is defined as a set of congruent or similar behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system or a healthcare agency that help healthcare professionals work effectively in cross-cultural situations. So a great example of this actually comes from Canada, where there is a toll-free number for healthcare workers to call in certain provinces that can link them with a translator to help bridge communication between them and a potential patient if they don't speak the same language. Yes, we have all these apps on our phones now that can do translation, but this was sort of a pioneering example of cultural competence because it allowed different healthcare professionals to act more effectively in the best interest of caring for their patients. So there are actually 5 components to an organization's ability to become more culturally competent. And it begins with actually valuing diversity, which includes valuing diversity of the workforce. So that means having the capacity to do a cultural self-assessment to identify if your organization actually reflects the community that you're serving. Being conscious of the dynamics when cultures interact, of potential conflicts or similarities, for example, and having an institutionalized cultural knowledge. And finally, having developed adaptations to service delivery, reflecting an understanding of cultural diversity. So, for example, if you work with community members who celebrate Sabbath, you may want to consider that you want to provide services that exist outside of that time, just as an example. So these are elements that should be reflected in the attitude structures of policies of any healthcare organization, in my opinion, because we know that for some people, it might be hard to separate inherent biases or religious beliefs when serving the healthcare of others. So connecting cultural competence to the professional values of the healthcare profession that a healthcare worker reflects is very important, to help keep things objective. And I see we have a comment. Hold on. Andre said, and unfortunately, the progress which occurred through the years is now in peril in some states. And that is the opinion of many. That's why there are concerns that I think are more specific in some states than others. And I think it's important that healthcare workers be attuned to what the political discussions and policies might be in the given state in which they're operating. And this all comes together. Why? And Lucy will tell us.
Why does it matter? Okay. There's a strong evidence that cultural competence training for healthcare professionals improves, provides knowledge, understanding, and skills for treating patients from culturally, logistically, and socioeconomic diverse backgrounds. Additional evidence is needed to determine effects on patient care and health outcomes. So there's still quite a bit of research that needs to be done. However, there is reported increased patient satisfaction and improved health outcome with clinically significant improvements. So we know this is especially true when it comes to long-term care and long-term planning. And sometimes, unfortunately, placement in long-term care sometimes comes down to the availability of a bed and having a means to pay for it. We've been facilitating sessions for the LGBTQ seniors and caregivers on how to find culturally competent long-term care and the importance of finding a facility in which people feel, in quotations, at home with regard to their culture or religion is really very, very important. Faith-based and culturally focused community groups and agencies can be very helpful in identifying culturally sensitive long-term care support in a variety of communities. Familiar things like language, food, celebration around tradition or holidays are linked to patient satisfaction and improved health outcomes, which impact both the patient and the caregivers supporting them. You know, training is like this. Training like this one is important to sensitize healthcare workers in ways in which we can show our patients and their caregivers that we appreciate who they are and where they're coming from. I would also like to say that it would be interesting for healthcare workers to role play with colleagues of different cultures, religions, or gender identity as a way to better sensitize ourselves to what others may be facing. And, you know, many times walking in someone else's shoes and some of the difficulties that or not only difficulties, but pleasures and just what people go through. And I think it's really, if it at all possible, as Elliot said before, to have this kind of sessions in workplaces where you can have a lunch together, people bringing different food, or having role playing and just getting to know each other on a different level, which then will transfer itself back to the patients and clients that you're serving at. So I'm just wondering, looking at the time, we have a little bit of time left. And I was wondering if anyone has any comments or any questions that you would like to add, as well as you, Elliot, and Glenda.
Well, I actually was curious to know from our participants today, if it comes to placement, just as an example of someone that you're working with, are you able to ask them of their cultural background or how important that is in the discussion of their long-term care placement? I think it's a conversation that doesn't actually happen very often because, as you said, Lucy, we're just trying to find an available bed, and everything else is second to it. But think of an individual, think of ourselves. I mean, I know that I would want to feel somewhere where I feel culturally at home. So I wanted to see if anyone has any comments about that.
And all you have to do is unmute your microphone and I will call on you, and we'd love to have you enter the discussion. The chat box is open too. Andre can speak to that.
Lily, you have a hand up. Feel free to unmute.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I just found out about it, so I'm coming in a little late. I'm Chinese American and have been caring for my mother. So this is so spot on. Thank you so much for highlighting this. I've been trying to become an advocate, and I realize how important something as simple as food and as important as food can be. So just seeing this slide brings up a huge smile to my heart. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much for that comment. And also representation. We don't have enough representation of Asian Americans as caregivers. So be an advocate wherever you can. I encourage everyone and our participants today who come from diverse cultural backgrounds to just think about that.
Absolutely. Well, if I may, I just want to say that quite a few years ago, I had a client who was thinking about placing her aunt, actually, but the aunt was from the gay community, and she was extremely concerned because her aunt kept it secret. I mean, she knew about it, but supposedly nobody else did. And she was really concerned about, the aunt had dementia, of where to place her so that she would feel comfortable. And was it okay to let the staff know that she might say something or whatever the case may be? And I'm just wondering, has anyone experienced that? And I know it was difficult to find the right place for this elderly woman, but we finally did. And it was interesting that the staff themselves asked for training around this gender issue. So I'm just wondering if anybody experienced that with your own clients or with a family member. Okay.
While people are thinking about it, I do want to just remind everyone that after the hour, Lucy and I will be staying on for a 30-minute extension of our program that will not be recorded. There's no script, no agenda, no presentation. We're just here to have an open, candid conversation. So if there are comments that you don't feel comfortable sharing in this group setting, you may want to reserve them for later, and you can also remain anonymous. This is a very important topic, I think, about long-term care placement. I had a colleague whose mom needed to be placed, and they come from a Caribbean background, and it was very important for her, as an example, that wherever her mom was placed had a knowledge of traditional foods or things that her mom really appreciated, so that it wasn't always incumbent upon her to make and bring these things. And it took a while, but they found a place where there are caregivers who also, professional caregivers who share the same cultural background, and her mom felt much more at home than the original nursing home where she had been placed and was the only Black resident on her floor. And it made her feel very triggered, even within her Alzheimer's, her advanced Alzheimer's, of previous experiences that were less than pleasant for her. So I think this is a very important one. We're going to leave you all with some resources, as we always do here, including additional training opportunities. And at the bottom, the Georgetown University National Center for Cultural Competence has a number of different things that you can bring to your actual workplace to workshop with colleagues and ideas of how to help promote cultural competence. So we hope that these resources will be of benefit to you and to those you work with. And we will turn it over to Glenda after I just read this last comment.
You have this last one.
Andre said, at one point, our team was faced with hired personal assistant workers whose cultural background would not accept the fact that we would encourage a senior to maintain their autonomy. They would insist on doing things for the person, assisting even when not necessary. It becomes quite difficult to come to a consensus. It's a very good point as well, that we actually didn't touch upon, but how different cultures view the role of providing care and I guess respecting is the right word, a senior's autonomy. That's a very good point. Thank you again, Andre.
All right, let me just go over momentarily what's coming up on the Caregiver Teleconnection, because we're zooming into the end of September already. So tomorrow at noon Central Time, Dr. Natalie Oliver will be back with us, and she's going to be talking about healthy brain and healthy aging. And I encourage you, if you've not heard Dr. Oliver before, tune in. She's just a wonderful presenter. And then on Friday, the 22nd at 10 o'clock Central Time, we have a Spanish language presentation on Medicare. And I think it's about the basics of Medicare. And so if you have clients who are primarily Spanish speaking, you may want to tell them about that particular session. Then it is again on Friday at 10 o'clock Central Time. I also wanted to tell you that you will receive a follow-up email if you register for the call or the session today. and it will be coming out in a couple of days, and you will get a copy of the presentation. We will ask you for feedback, how you liked the session, what you got out of the session. And I always encourage people to also tell us if there are topics that you would like us to present, or speakers that you've heard that maybe we can contact and have them join us on the Caregiver Teleconnection. And I was looking at my notes a minute ago and found that somebody had asked at one point in time, could you see these presentations on YouTube? And the answer is yes. If you will put in WellMed, I think that they will pop up, or you may search for Lucy or Elliot by their name and see those sessions also pop up in YouTube. So that's something relatively new for us, but I think it gives us broader reach in the people that we want to, get in touch with, caregivers, that is. So you'll see, you had a couple of more things.
And I will add, Glenda, that if you actually just look up our names or WellMed Charitable Foundation or Caregiver Teleconnection on Google, and you look up videos, all of those videos will pop up. So it's a lot more user-friendly.
Yes.
We've just got some messages of thanks, and we're always so appreciative of your feedback and your time. So thank you so much for joining us. And again, we welcome everyone to stay on after the hour and continue the discussion with us.
It's been my pleasure to be with you today. And I'm going to leave you now. And don't forget, Lily has her hand up again. So let me go ahead and stop the recording. And I'll see y'all next month on the Caregiver Teleconnection. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Glenda. Thank you for the wonderful comment.